Today I'd like to welcome Dr. Ricardo Barcelona to our CEO chats. Dr. Barcelona started his career at USAID. He then worked at Schlumberger, was Assistant Vice President at JP Morgan, was the Global Director and Head of Power, Gas, and Water at ABN AMRO Bank, was the Head of Global Projects at Shell, is an adjunct professor at the Asian Institute of Management, and is the Managing Director at Barcino Capitas Limited. Dr. Barcelona is a distinguished speaker and an author of multiple books, the most recent being Dynamic Decisions, Energy Pivot, Adaptive Moves, Winning Bounce, which can be found on Amazon, Target, or other online book retailers. And a link to Dr. Barcelona's book will be available at the end of this video. Phew, Dr. Barcelona, that was a mouthful. What a distinguished career up to this point. Welcome to our show. You have an incredible background in the energy industry, as well as authored some interesting books and articles that I just mentioned, such as Dynamic Decisions, Energy Pivot, Adaptive Moves, Winning Bounce. How has your background and expertise helped you be able to identify new energy investment opportunities?
I think going back to the background that I have, I think it is not a very common background where somebody started in academe, then goes into industry, and then from industry into investment banking, and after investment banking, go back to academe. Yeah, so I think I'm quite privileged. I'm quite privileged to be in academia right after graduating from a university, where I got involved with not only with energy issues, but also with developmental issues, right in an emerging market, well, where I was born in the Philippines. And shortly after that, moved into industry in Hong Kong, in Taipei, got involved with treasury. And in that role, I was pretty much thrown into the deep end to try to learn very quickly how to manage the international trade flows of commodities, and at the same time to manage the treasury out of Hong Kong. Then from there, shortly after, I went to my MBA program at ESA Business School in Barcelona, and then moved into Schlumberger, and from Schlumberger, moved into investment banking by one happy coincidence, because my professor happens to be setting up an investment banking operations in Madrid before I ended up in the city of London. So quite fortunately, all the things that I have learned in the industry and previously in the development area for my academic work was quite instrumental in informing the work that I did in privatization. Because at the end of the day, when we start doing privatization during the term of the late Prime Minister Maggie Thatcher, you're actually involving in development economics and at the same time restructuring of industry with the hope that a country would progress further under private ownership. So that's where the contribution from my previous work came in. Then, of course, going into Shell, that continued with some of the restructuring work that we've done in Shell, and trying to also restructure the businesses around midstream, downstream, and also the upstream side of the oil and gas business. And of course, in the process, we're transitioning from an oil-dominated company into a gas-oriented economy, and not only into the gas, but also the start of the foray of an oil and gas company like Shell into renewable energy. And the rest of that is history. And back in academe, I can look back to those experiences and say, what has industry gotten right and what has academia gotten right? And I think the combination of the two results in some interesting insights. That is a subject of the topics of my two books, Energy Investments and Dynamic Decisions.
Thank you for that background. I do think you have a very unique experience having been an operator, an investment banker, and now being in the world of academics. With that experience, what is your outlook on the world's use of fossil fuels, as well as the world's push for alternative, clean, renewable energy sources such as geothermal, wind, or solar?
Okay, let's put a context into that conversation. I think the present conversation, if we just read the media and if we read the business press, it is very tempting to think of the world into something like a black and white. Yeah, it's either you're promoting fossil fuel or you're promoting renewables. Yeah, I think the reality is, well, those are, I think, the extreme views. Yeah, as far as the climate and the energy transition conversation is concerned. Yeah, the real world is probably somewhere in between, where for a very, very long time to come, we're going to see a hybrid system where renewables and fossil fuel would coexist, I think, for much, much longer than we'd care to imagine. Yeah. Well, does that mean that we should not be doing anything about promoting renewable energy? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is to manage that process, because at each stage of the transition, different kinds of opportunities and different kinds of profit niches is going to evolve. Yeah. So there was a time when being first in the gas business positioned a company like Shell, like BP, for example, and some other European companies who were earlier in the game of gas reap the benefits, yeah, as the preference for cleaner sources of energy becomes more mainstream. Yeah? Now, in the same way, people who are betting in the right kind of renewable energy may potentially reap the benefits. Yeah. And this is a combination of finding those opportunities either in the works of R&D, research and development. But I think instead of research and development, I would actually focus more on research and engineering. Yeah. Because most of the technologies are available now. Yeah. It's just a question of making them better, making them cheaper, and making them commercially viable. Yeah. And on the last part, and this is where I think I part company with some of the mainstream views in the marketplace. The future of energy is probably not in the bigger, the better type of mindset, but rather if we can make things smaller, the opportunities probably would expand. Yeah. And we can probably cite specific examples of that in the latter part of our conversations.
I appreciate that. You have mentioned this in your book Dynamic Decisions, that there are challenges being a first mover in terms of geothermal development and the amount of capital required to be able to develop and explore new technologies. What are the major challenges you see that face new energy alternatives such as geothermal?
Okay, let's talk about geothermal. Yeah. We love to talk about solar power being available anywhere in the world, being abundant, being limitless. Actually, geothermal is a more efficient source of energy. Is it available anywhere? In theory, it is. Yeah. Now, what is preventing us from exploiting geothermal? Yeah, just to give you an example, the proven reserves in Indonesia, which is now the second largest geothermal producer after it overtook the Philippines, but not as big as the US. Yeah, so US, Indonesia, and the Philippines are the three largest geothermal players now in the world. They are only using less than 5% of the proven reserves. So what happened to the 95%? Yeah. Well, here's a problem. Private companies are faced with a big dilemma whenever they explore for geothermal. In using conventional technology, and these are usually the large hole drilling technology, you probably need to sink in on a small project, probably around $30 million, yeah, to deploy equipment to a place you're not even sure that is the right place to drill. Yeah. And the reason for that is you have to build all the civil works, build the roads before you can bring the large equipment in. So what is one of the examples of making something big into something smaller so that you create a viable market for that technology? Slim hole technology came into being. Now, the slim hole drilling technology is not something new. It's been around for centuries. In fact, Japan is a big user of slim hole technology, and the Icelandic side of the world is also, the Icelandic companies, that is, have developed some very good technology on the slim hole exploration. Yeah. So the long and short of it is, well, probably for 5 million or thereabouts, you can do some test drilling. You don't need to build roads to get to the sites. All you need to do is, because the equipment are a lot smaller, you bring it in by helicopters. Yeah. So if it's a question of betting 5 million, that whether you find the right drilling site or not, that's something that a private company can risk. Yeah. Not 30 million.
Right.
Yeah. So by changing the technology, by making the drilling technology a smaller size, what you end up doing is actually making exploration a lot cheaper. Yeah. And so the front end risk, which is very high because it's a 50-50 chance in the best circumstances, either you get the geothermal steam or you don't. Yeah.
Right.
And if you don't, you move somewhere else. Yeah. So by making the risk of failure a lot more affordable, then more drilling could take place. And the more drilling that you do, the more likely are you going to find, the right location. Pretty much like an oil and gas drilling activity or exploration activity.
You also mention this in your book, but can the private sector alone champion the exploration and development of new energy sources, or must governments be involved and supportive? If governments must be involved, what policy changes or subsidies must there be to ensure that these new alternative energy sources have a chance?
Yeah, I think it varies from country to country, but I think at the generic level, as far as dealing with government is concerned, one thing I learned in the oil and gas industry in my days with Shell, yeah, and this is one advice that I value so much. One of the senior executives at Shell, who actually was my boss at that time, was telling me, he said, you can run all the economics for all I care. If you forget the element of politics and the element of engaging with politicians, then all the wonderful work that you do in economics is probably going to go to waste. Yeah. And I said, how's that? I said, well, because the government, whether we like it or not, is our partner and is an essential part of the business. So how did the government get into that position? So let's talk about geothermal. In most countries, the geothermal resource is oftentimes classified as a natural resource. And as a natural resource, the government is the resource holder. Yeah. So in other words, as a private company, we are renting access to those resources from the owner, who in this case is the government. Yeah. So whether we like it or not, when we drill in any country, we are guests of these countries. Yeah. And of course, all kinds of geopolitical issues and questions that are very legitimate will come up. Yeah. So how do we share the revenue? How do we benefit the people? And at the end of the day, that is where royalty payments become justified. Yeah. So not only in taxation, but also in the ownership structure of the resource. Yeah. So that's an important aspect of that. Now, of course, the other aspect is, so why does the government need us as a private capital, as a private entity? Well, oftentimes governments do not possess the technological know-how, but that is something they can always hire somebody. They can always learn from their partners in the form of joint ventures, as it happens in a number of countries. Yeah. Now, but through specialization, private companies like Shell not only is providing technology, but is also developing and enhancing the technology and the know-how and the processes of finding geothermal steam or oil and gas. And so it is that kind of advantage that the government would value. Yeah. So at the end of the day, there is a true basis for partnership. Yeah. Yeah. When there's real expertise being offered to the private sector, and at the same time, there is a legitimate structure where business could be undertaken within a country. Yeah? And I'm really talking about the legal rights, the rights to property, and the security of tenure. Yeah? To name a few.
You bring up a good point. I feel a lot of small private companies overlook the importance of working with local, state, or federal politicians because they're so focused on commercializing their own product, but may not understand the impact the government may have in the ultimate deliverability of their product. Another thing you mentioned in your book was the value or overuse of government subsidies, and you gave an example of heavy subsidies in the solar industry. What we learned was those subsidies were not a great long-term or sustainable approach because while subsidies or tax credits may be useful up front to initiate the use of a new energy source, if the product cannot be economically viable on its own, then there's not much hope that the product can survive. In your opinion, what are the pros or cons of energy subsidies versus using a form of carbon taxation on the use of fuels we want to get away from, to allow newer forms of energy such as geothermal to become economically viable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk about the subsidies to start with. Yeah, in the way that governments operate, yeah, something that is temporary tends to become something very permanent. Yeah. So when a government starts subsidizing something, let's say the intention is to subsidize for the first 3 years. Yeah. After the third year, there's another conversation between the private party and the government. Said, well, yeah, maybe we're nice people, so maybe we'll extend that for another 3 years. Yeah. And before you know it, what started out as a privilege has now become a right. Yeah. And a right has become a claim on government. Yeah. Now, my question is, if a technology would require subsidies throughout its operating life, maybe we should ask ourselves whether that technology is indeed sustainable from a commercial perspective. Probably they're not. And if the technology is not commercially sustainable, then one cannot really talk about sustainability, yeah, over the next 2 generations when you have to keep on subsidizing something. Now, so So the end result is when a government starts to champion a technology, almost for certain, that technology is going to fail. Yeah. Now, what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is we look at the landscape. We look at the landscape today, and we try to project what the future energy landscape would look like. We would realize one thing immediately. We know the technology that we do not like, which is the polluting technology. We know the technology that we would rather have, which is a non-polluting technology. But for sure, I do not know, and I'm sure many people would not even know how the technology would evolve in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time. Yeah. Now, with that kind of ambiguity, with that kind of uncertainty, we need to inject a lot of flexibility and a lot of agility in the decision making of the managers. Yeah. So, as a government, what I will do is basically say, I'm going to tax the polluting technology because that is something that you and I can agree is something that is not very desirable and something that is not desirable that we want to discourage. You penalize it with taxation. And the effect of taxation is that you're increasing the price of energy. And as the price of energy increases, then you allow more technologies to become viable. And that decision is probably best left in the hands of a private manager. Yeah. Because they have more flexibility and they're probably more agile than any bureaucrat sitting behind a government office trying to regulate an industry that is inherently volatile and dynamic.
That makes a lot of sense. Our experience is that politicians have very little understanding of all of these energy sources, and for them to make intelligent decisions on what is best for the markets or society based on the little knowledge they have is pretty dangerous. What areas of energy investment get you most excited right now?
Well, right now, geothermal and hydro is probably where I would focus my attention on, which is a minority view, I would admit. Yeah. And the reason that I always encounter when I propose this idea, either in conferences or with the CEOs of companies, they say, but geothermal and hydro is a very small part of the energy mix. And since actually to the contrary, 15% of the energy mix is already accounted for by hydro. And when people talk about renewable, at least in most countries, with the exception of the few that has developed and become successful in introducing, let's say, wind power. Yeah. When you talk about renewable energy, you're really talking about hydro. Yeah. And in the three countries that I've mentioned, the US, Indonesia, and the Philippines, when you talk about renewable, you're actually talking about geothermal energy. Yeah. Now, just like the wonderful thing about energy mix on a global scale, this is, I think, where the nuance becomes important. Yeah. Because if we talk about solar and wind growing very fast, and there's a very big uptake, the reality is it's actually being driven by probably about 10 countries in the world. Yeah. And the rest of the countries probably have a very, very small share of wind or solar in their mix. Yeah. So in the same way, with hydro and geothermal, A few countries are championing it. A few countries have invested, but most countries are probably not even bothering with hydro and geothermal. Yeah. Now, what makes me excited about hydro and geothermal? Well, first of all, you don't need to change the grid and the infrastructure that already exists. Yeah. Because most of these things could be just plugged into an existing network, and with very little adaptation, things could work. Yeah. The second aspect of that, of course, is when we talk about the conversion of energy into useful forms of energy that you can use to power your car, yeah, to power your house or whatever, the conversion rate is actually very high. Yeah. So if you have a rated capacity of 100 for hydrogeothermal, between 85 to 95% of that capacity could be turned into the equivalent of an output. Yeah. In the case of solar, the reality is you're not even hitting 20%. Yeah. So those are the first things that I would look at. The two other things that I would look at, which is again a minority view at this stage, is actually wind farms. Okay, the onshore wind is probably more conventional and more mainstream nowadays, because onshore wind is now hitting something like close to 40%. Yeah, conversion rate. Offshore wind is where I am really focusing my attention on. Yeah, because that, in a perspective of the next 10 years, that's probably where most of the growth of new installations will have to come from in order to meet the decarbonization targets of governments. Of course, on top of what we need to invest in hydro, what we need to invest in geothermal, and maybe what we need to continue to invest in gas.
Dr. Barcelona, I want to thank you again for your time today on our CEO chat. Your background and expertise bring a unique and valuable perspective to this industry. I hope people will read your book, and we'll include that link below this video, and see how your methodologies could be useful in the advancement of new energy sources and technologies. I hope you and your family the best for this new year.
Sure, and thank you for spreading the word.
It's been my pleasure. Have a great one.